Hey, you're listening to the wrong podcast. Topics today include pencils, racism, and Ukraine.
Wrong! What's wrong with you? What's wrong with y'all?
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you people? Wrong! You do have to tolerate it. It's my show.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm here to talk about politics, culture, religion, sports, and anything else you're not allowed to talk about in polite company. Issue number 1! Miraculous! There is this article. I'm going to direct you to it. It's called iPencil. And you can go to my website, thewrongpodcast.com, to find the full thing, or you can do a web search for it. It's excellent. Let me give you a brief overview. You have no idea how to make a pencil. In fact, probably no one in the world knows how to make a pencil. It is amazing that we have pencils. You know, as modern inventions go, the pencil is probably one of the simpler ones. It's very basic. You got your wood, the graphite, the little brass ring at the end of it, and the eraser. The ring's holding the eraser. And that's it. It's very simple, very few parts. You have no idea how to create any of that. Just think about it for a moment. Just think. Okay, the wood. The wood seems very basic, right? All right, we don't need to make wood. We just need to cut wood. Okay, finding the right wood. You've had bad pencils where when you sharpen them, they're a mess, right? You got to get the right kind of wood. It's got to be, just strong enough, just soft enough for sharpening. By the way, you got to invent a sharpener somehow. I mean, I guess we could all use knives, but that's not great. So you got to get the right kind of wood, and you got to get that wood into the right kind of shape. Now, all of this is probably the simplest part of the entire thing, is getting the right kind of wood and getting it into the right kind of shape. And if you're sufficiently educated enough about woodworking, you're like, well, yeah, I could do this or that, and I could get it to this. Here's the deal. Wood doesn't come in that shape with a little tube inside. You can't drill that out long enough. You've actually got to glue the wood together. Do you know how to make glue? I don't know how to make glue. I guess glue must not be that hard. But still, I have no idea how glue is made. How many horses exactly does it take? Nobody's ever told me. And you got to paint that thing. You got to, put lacquer on it. You got to put paint on it. Do you have any idea how to make lacquer? Do you know how to make paint? I don't know. I've used a ton of paint in my life. I have no idea how to create paint. Okay, that's the simple part. Now comes all the rest of it. The graphite. It's not lead. You probably knew that. It's graphite. What's graphite? I don't even know where to find graphite. And apparently it's not just graphite. It's like mixed with like mud, and you got to, make the right kind of mixture there, knowing how, what kind of mud and where to find graphite, how to mine it. I don't think very many of us know. I mean, some people clearly know how to do the graphite part, but most of us don't. And so you then have to, once you figure out how to get the graphite and how to make it, you got to figure out how to make it into that shape, that long, skinny, fragile shape. And you got to make sure not to break it. And you've all sharpened a pencil long enough to know it breaks easy. Okay, so you've made that shape. You put it in the wood, you've glued the wood together, you've painted the whole thing. Now you need to get the little brass ring on the end of it that's going to hold the eraser. Now, brass is made from zinc and copper. Okay, you got to find copper. From what I understand, there's a lot of copper in Arizona. So I've got to dig into the mountains of Arizona. It's so hot and sweaty there, by the way. So I get the copper. I've got to find zinc from somewhere. I've got to mine that. And then I've got to combine them And, this is brass. This is what? Copper Age technology? Copper Age? It's not Stone Age. It's Iron Age technology to make brass. Okay. So it's been around for thousands of years, but still, this seems difficult and not something any of us do every day. So you've made the brass, and then you've got to make it into a thin little piece, and then you've got to wrap it around, and never mind all the decorative part of it and the little lines that you've got to, somehow pound out of this brass. Then comes the eraser. Now, what exactly is that eraser made out of? Let me give you a hint. It's not rubber. Like, if it was rubber, it might be a lot easier. Like, okay, rubber comes from trees. I just got to find a rubber tree. Nope. It's something. I think there's rubber that's like a part of it, but most of it is just like chemicals that you've never heard of, or I've never heard of. And they also dye it a certain color, like it doesn't come pink. All that to say, this is amazing. Like I'm sure all of these steps are written down in different books around the world somewhere. But you've got to find all those books, and you've got to master each of these steps in order to make a simple pencil. This just, it shows how complex the world is right now. Never mind TVs and microwaves and how does the internet work? Gosh, just the pencil itself is mind-blowing. What is taking place in the worldwide market to bring these simple little things that, we basically throw away into our lives. Issue number 2, racist. Okay, there is an organization known as the Anti-Defamation League, and you've probably heard of them. They fight against anti-Semitism, and God bless their work. Nobody should be an anti-Semite. Nobody should be treating Jews poorly, particularly, the history of racism against Jews is legendary, and it's recent, and it's still ongoing, and an organization like the Anti-Defamation League needs to exist. Now, when the ADL goes about their work, it makes sense that they need to define some terms. What is anti-Semitism? What is racism? Etc. What is segregation? And they have recently changed their definition of what racism is. And I'm going to read to you first their old definition, and then I will give you the new definition. So the old definition was, racism is the belief that a particular race is superior or inferior to another, that a person's social and moral traits are predetermined by his or her inborn biological characteristics. They go on to say, racial separatism is the belief most of the time based on racism, that different races should remain segregated and apart from one another. And I think this is a reasonable definition of racism. Maybe somebody could come up with a better one. I can't in the moment. That a particular race is superior or inferior to another is that kind of makes sense to me. That's probably in your mind. Yep, that's great. Okay, here's their new definition. Racism is the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Now, I have a massive problem with this definition. First off, let me just be clear. White people absolutely are guilty of racism. Absolutely. Systemic racism in the United States, I believe it exists. I believe there are systems that privilege white people and denigrate people of color. No argument about that at all. My problem is that it's defining racism down to a very local, cultural, national issue in the United States. And racism is so much broader and so much bigger than that. Yes, perhaps, absolutely, I'm willing to concede that perhaps white people have used racism much more often and much more successfully to advance their own privileges more than any other people in the history of the world. I could perhaps concede that. It's not important to me, though, because I think racism is bigger than that. I think racism happens in much smaller groups, and it happens amongst people of color, where white people are not part of the society or culture. They're not factoring in. You don't need white people for racism to exist. And let me give you just one very good example that's happening right now. There is a genocide literally happening in China right now. Absolutely, it's genocide. We can call it that. The trains and everything. Forced sterilizations, murder of people. The Uyghur people, they live in the western part of China, and they are not ethnically Han. Most of the time when you think of Chinese people, when you think of someone who's Chinese, you're thinking of somebody who is of the Han dynasty. And there are lots of ethnic groups in China. One of those ethnic groups are the Uyghurs, and they are traditionally Muslim. Now, Islam is basically outlawed in the communist government of China. And so the Chinese don't recognize them as Muslim, but they're ethnically, typically Muslim, and they're of a different race than the Han people. And the Chinese Communist Party has had enough of the Uyghurs. They aren't kowtowing to all the rules and traditions and regulations of the communist system. They're just not getting with this. They're not getting with it. And so the Uyghurs are literally being rounded up and forced to work and forced into sterilization and murdered. This is happening. And this is not to the benefit or the privilege of white people. The Han are doing this. The Han people, I should say, the Chinese government is doing this for the benefit of the Han people against the Uyghurs. This is racism, and it has nothing to do with systemic white privilege. So, the Winter Olympics are about to start this week. I believe the opening ceremony is within days of me releasing this podcast. And, I am sick about this genocide. Genocide is something that we said should never happen again. There is no argument over the atrocities of the Holocaust. We don't want that kind of thing happening to any kind of people group ever again. And I have no power over the Chinese Communist Party. There's very little I can do. But the Olympics are about to start in China, and I am sick about what is happening there. And part of the Olympic opening ceremonies is a celebration of the host country and all their cultural contributions to the world. And I'm not interested in watching a celebration of China right now. I can't do it. There are lots of great athletes that have nothing to do with any of this, but they are being used as pawns to promote the virtue of the Chinese government right now. And I just can't have it. I'm not going to watch the Olympics at all. And I'm sorry for the great athleticism or the accomplishments of many athletes around the world, what they're going to do. I'm sorry. Good luck. I hope you win your medals. I have nothing against you or your accomplishments. If I knew an athlete, I would celebrate them, but I'm not watching because I'm hoping that at least NBC will recognize, hey, maybe we shouldn't be in business with China. And maybe other media companies, maybe other corporations will say, hey, this just isn't worth the cost to us anymore. It's actually hurting our bottom line to be in business with China. And, God bless the weaker people. And we've got to find some solution to protect them. Remember, I want to know what's wrong with you.
What's wrong with you?
If you'd like to submit a question, topic, or tell me how I was wrong, you can email me at listen@therongpodcast.com or submit a comment at my website, therongpodcast.com. And help me spread the wrong message. If you like what you hear, share it with your friends. Issue number 3, Crimea River. So you've probably heard in the news that Russia is building up a huge military force on the border of Ukraine. And I want to give you a very brief history. So brief, like I am not an expert on this at all. I just know a few things, and I'm just going to tell you the few things I know because they've helped me understand the situation. Hopefully they'll help you as well. There's probably a lot more to learn, and I'm sure all of us will learn more about the situation as it evolves. First off, we don't call it the Ukraine.
Wrong!
If you type that, as I was typing these show notes, I typed the Ukraine, and the grammar corrections on it said, no, remove that the. And of course, yes, you should not call it the Ukraine. And I don't know how that happened, but in English or in America, we started calling it the Ukraine. And Ukraine is a separate country than Russia. It's not part of Russia. It's not like the Everglades or the American Southwest. It is its own separate country. So just drop the. Okay. Second, loosely think of Texas as Ukraine. Everything else I'm about to say, it will help you if you just situate your mind, just, kind of change the situation a little bit. And Texas is roughly in the same place as Ukraine is, according to Russia. It's not wrapped around, but sort of it's in the southwest corner. And Texas, has its own history of independence. The people are very independent. They're rough and they're fierce. All the things you kind of think of Texas, they loosely apply to Ukraine. Okay, that will just help everything else I'm about to say. So the Cossacks, you might have heard of them. They were these fierce, roving military tribes, and they came out of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians were fiercely independent. Like nobody could rule them or conquer them. They were just their own people. Eventually, and they were great horsemen, like just fantastic on horses. And at a certain time in history, horses were everything when it came to military warfare. So these Cossack tribes, they started hiring themselves out. And the Romanov family started taking power in Russia. And they eventually became the monarchy in Russia. They became the head czar was a Romanov. And the way the Romanovs came to power was through the Cossacks. They hired the Cossacks, and they were the czar's hammer. Now, Russia had its own army, but the Cossacks were the royal family's special unit. And if an uprising broke out somewhere, they would literally slaughter people. Like in the name of the czar, they would crush the rebellion and restore order. So Ukraine is very important to the history of Russia. In about the 19th century, Ukrainians started agitating for their own independence from Russia. And Russia did not like this. And so they enacted several things to tamp down Romanian nationalism. The first was they banned the publication of the Ukrainian language. You couldn't publish anything in Ukrainian. You could only publish in Russian. So that seriously reined in the independent Ukrainian culture. It made it disappear to a large degree. And then in addition, they started talking about how there were three kinds of Russians. There were Great Russians, and those are the kind of people that you and I think of as Russians today. And then there were the Little Russians, and those were Ukrainians. Ukrainians were referred to as Little Russians. And then there were White Russians, and those were the people in Belarus, which is north of Ukraine, west of Russia, kind of, next to Austria and Hungary. So they've erased the culture and language of Ukraine and erased the individual ethnic identity of Ukrainians and incorporated them into Russians as a whole. Now, every time throughout history, when Russia has been invaded from Europe, from Western Europe, it's been in part, at least, through the Ukraine. Ukraine, did I just say the Ukraine? I did. I'm sorry. It's been in part, at least, through Ukraine. And so Ukraine is a very important military border for Russia. They're concerned about what might be coming through Ukraine at any point in history. So at the end of the Romanov dynasty, towards the tail end of World War I, in fact, it was a reason for the end of World War I, and World War I was a reason for the end of the Romanov dynasty. Both the Cossacks stopped defending Tsar Nicholas. And once he no longer had the Cossacks on his side, he had to abdicate the throne. So he leaves, and eventually he and his family are murdered by the Bolsheviks. And for a very brief period, a transitional government is set up, and it's democratic in Russia. And they're still trying to sort out how to get out of World War I, and large portions of Russia are actually taken over by Germany and Austria and Hungary, but mostly Germany. And that includes most or all of Ukraine. Well, when the war ends, Germany has to give everything back. And Ukraine there's full-on civil war in Russia at this point. The Bolsheviks are trying to take over, and everybody who's not a communist is fighting against the Bolsheviks. And that includes Ukraine and the Cossacks. And they're a holdout against this communist rule. Eventually they fall too, and they become part of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union expands in south into some Muslim territories and to the north, to the west, and is in a pretty stable place for about 50 years. Then in 1986, I might have the year wrong, but the Chernobyl nuclear disaster takes place. And Chernobyl is in Ukraine. And again, I have to encourage you to see the miniseries produced by HBO called Chernobyl. Find a way to watch it. You're not going to be watching the Olympics over the next 2 weeks. Just go watch Chernobyl instead. I promise you it's a better use of your time. So Chernobyl happens, and the big lesson of Chernobyl is that if you live by lies, those lies eventually will kill you. The whole communist system in the Soviet Union was based on the idea that the state is perfect. The state will take care of you. The state is competent. They know what they're doing. And you can't ever criticize the state because they are our God. They, for lack of a better term, they do everything right. And in fact, they weren't doing everything right. And they built this nuclear power plant with insufficient protections against a nuclear explosion. And in fact, there was a meltdown and a crisis. It was a crisis, but it could have been a far greater crisis. Like if the meltdown had continued, it could have wiped out half the population of Ukraine. Like it would have been devastating. And it could be that we would all be living to some degree with some radiation poisoning because they did such a bad job constructing this nuclear power plant. Well, after they stopped the mess, the Ukrainian people are not happy with the Soviet Union. Like, it's clear, like, hey, this government is not working the way it tells us it is, and it's oppressive on top of all of that. And eventually, Ukraine, in about 1989, says to the Soviet Union, hey, we want out of this union. We're done. We're going to govern ourselves. And they're the second largest economy in the Soviet Union. And Russia says, well, look, if Ukraine's out, then we can't support the entire union. Like we need their money, we need their economy, we need their resources. We're not going to be able to support this whole thing without Ukraine. So a week after Ukraine leaves the Soviet Union, the entire Soviet Union collapses. Now, to get out of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, they put forward a compromise. They say, hey, we'll not be a Soviet Union anymore, but let's form a looser confederacy. And this confederacy can be controlled by Moscow. And not seeing many other solutions, Moscow agrees to it. Russia agrees to this confederacy. And then the Ukraine does not, I said it again, the Ukraine. And then Ukraine does not join the confederacy. They say, oh, just kidding. It sounded like a good idea, but we're going to go off on our own. And so they become their own separate individual country. And Russia has never been happy about that ever since. They're like, hey, that confederacy idea was pretty good. We still want that. We want influence on all these other countries that are around us and we're part of the former Soviet Union. We want to have a say on what's going on. And Ukraine has held firm and said no. Now there's several other nations, Lithuania, Estonia, they actually went even farther and they joined NATO. NATO is a treaty, a military treaty, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I hope I have that right. But basically, NATO was formed to stop Soviet aggression, to stop military expansion from Russia. And so all these former Soviet states have joined NATO. Ukraine has not. They have held out. But they're interested. They're like, hey, maybe we should join NATO. And Russia is like, no, you cannot join. Ukraine cannot join NATO. Absolutely not. That will put us at too much of a threat from military expansion from Western Europe. In addition, there's a large number of ethnic Russians in southeastern Ukraine. And Russia feels like they have some responsibility to their own ethnic people. So, in the 30 years or so since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has continued to meddle in the politics of the countries surrounding itself, including Ukraine. They've tried to sway campaigns. They've assassinated and poisoned politicians in Ukraine if they were speaking out against Russia. And during the Obama administration, they actually invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which is in the southeastern part of Ukraine. Think Florida, basically. Russia captures this peninsula, and nobody does jack squat about it. Like, all right, hey, that's not cool that you're doing that. Here's some economic sanctions, but really, all right, it's yours now. And so this is kind of an expansion. This is possibly an expansion on what they've done in the Crimea Peninsula. Russia probably has no means or intention of incorporating Ukraine into its own country. Most Ukrainians say they'll take up a gun if Russia invades. It would be an ugly, ugly mess if they tried to capture and control or incorporate Ukraine into Russia. Most likely, they want parts of Ukraine for resources, and or they want to put up a puppet government in Ukraine that's run by Ukrainians, but is loyal to Russia. And nobody's really sure what's going to happen, or whether or not they'll invade, or if this is just all posturing so that Putin gets recognition from the West and maybe gets some concessions. So imagine if Texas left the United States and Mexico was quite fond of invading the United States through Texas. So Texas was independent. They say, and Texans will be the first to tell you always, hey, we're allowed to leave the Union whenever we want to. That's what it says in our Constitution. We can be an independent country anytime we want. So for whatever reason, Texas decides to leave the United States and become its own separate nation. And then Mexico is like tempting Texas to join into their own military alliance. They say, hey, things would be better for you if you, weren't friendly with the United States anymore. You were more friendly to Mexico. And the United States is like, hey, that's not cool. Like, we want Texas to be part of the United States still. And it's certainly not cool that they're thinking about, buddying up to Mexico more than us. That's a good way to think about this situation. But I could be wrong. If you think I am, let me know, and let me know why. I had fun, and I hope you did too. Bye-bye.